Hello. I'm actually I already recorded a video that I was totally gonna post for you guys. And my phone ran out of space and stopped recording like 13 minutes into the video. I'm not really 100% sure why I did it because I still had like a gig and a half of space left, unless it was like a precautionary thing where it didn't want me to fill up my space. So it was like, whoa, bro, you gotta stop recording. But it told me essentially I was full of memory. Usually, when something tells you, hey, I can't do my job because I'm full of memory, you expect to see 0% memory because, that would be what they kind of told you. But when you get into your system and find out you instead have a gig and a half, it's kind of like, huh, because that doesn't mean I don't have memory. That just means I have low memory. So, not really sure again. So I really hope that this video decides that it's not going to shut off 13 minutes into it, because then I might just give up on trying to make a video. um, but yeah, I'm going to explain to you a story that you don't care about, but I'm going to tell you anyways. Or well, it's like a story slash kind of still current and whatever. But it's about cars, okay? So I've posted, I mean, probably if we could go back, I mean, we can go back since they're all still there, but I don't particularly want to watch every single video I've ever posted. But yeah, essentially, if I were to watch every single video I had ever posted, um, and tallied up the amount of times that I talked in the video about problems with a vehicle of mine, or yeah, that's pretty much it, because that's pretty much all that ever seems that I have information about vehicles. So it's usually because something's broken, and I'm like, I don't have money to fix it, or the time, or whatever. So when I started making videos more regularly, and I was doing the whole denture thing, I was inside of a 1990. Wait, no, I was inside of a 2001 Ford Taurus. And the only reason I get confused is because I don't know how it kind of worked this way, but I actually have owned a 93, a 97, a 99, a 2001, and and that was it. Yeah, so all those years of Ford Tauruses. They're good cars. It makes it seem like I went through cars a lot. I mean, I owned them for many years before I end up getting another one, but it's just a fact of usually I was the culprit. The first couple actually the very first one I just wrecked. It was my dad's. I consider it mine because it was like my daily driver once I got my license, but it was my dad's car. Um, Funny story about that as well. We'll continue, but about a month into driving it, somebody pulled out in front of me, and I got into my first and hopefully only wreck that I was the driver of. Um, so that car went away, and then my dad got a 1997, and and it was actually not a Taurus, it was a Mercury Sable. But if you know anything about like cars and models, it was a Ford Taurus. It was Mercury's version of the Ford Taurus, because Ford and Mercury are the same company. So yeah, Mercury Sable is a Ford Taurus. So it was a Mercury Sable, but again, it's a Ford Taurus, and I would never have obtained that car if not for the circumstances that arose from that car, which was, um, I caught it on fire, and I completely burnt the entire driver's seat out of it, and the floor, and all kinds of other things. I luckily caught it before the car like burnt down, so I was able to put it out. But yeah, that was hard to explain to my dad. Hey, Dad, you know how you let me borrow your car while you were out of town? Ha ha! I smoked a cigarette in it, even though you told me not to, and I caught the car on fire. So yeah, that was great. So essentially, he told me I had to buy it, and luckily for me, he had only purchased it 6 months earlier, and it was from a buddy of his mom that had couldn't drive anymore, so she sold it to him for $500. So I only had to pay $500, but that's essentially how I owned my first car. Was I had to burn it down. So you might be wondering how I drove it with no driver's seat, and I would tell you I put a seat cover on top of it, like a seat cover you would use outside on a patio chair, and I just drove, and people were mind blown by, like, they'd look at my car and be like, dude, you have a wire framed seat. And I'd be like, yeah, that's the inside of the seat when the rest of it burns away. It's still a seat, it still has metal, it still holds itself, it's just no cushion. So you put a cushion on top and boom, you got yourself a seat. But clearly the rest of the car was still charred, and it took about probably 6.5 months driving it with the windows down before the damn smell went away of nasty burnt plastic. It was bad. It sucked for a first car, but it was cool because I had no intentions in actually buying a car, and then, like, I burnt this car down, and then I had to take ownership of it. But yeah, its transmission went out. I was a bit of a lead foot, which I still kind of am, but yeah, I was a bit of a lead foot, and the tranny went out in it. And then I got the 2001, 93, 97, 2001. I don't know. I get confused. I've had like 4 or 5, and that's why I get confused, because I think I've had a couple of the same year, which I know at least with the 2001s, I had 2 2001s, because again, I had a 2001 that I got that was like dope. It was, weird to say for a Taurus, but it was like one that somebody at some point had spent a lot of money and got like the best, biggest package you could get on the car. So I had fancy radio, leather seats, just all kinds of fanciness. And unfortunately for me, I tore the transmission out of that one too. That one was the fastest, about 1.5 years of owning it, and it was dead. No drive and no go. Well, let me rephrase that. It would go in first, but second was gone, and third had like the top end of it, but the bottom end wasn't there. So essentially what I had to do to get it home was floor it in first gear, essentially redline the living hell out of the motor, but get it to the point where I can guarantee the motor has pulled itself to the maximum that it can physically pull itself, and then shift it into third and hope that I was going fast enough that the high end part of third would catch just enough to grind the living shit out of it to continue going, and then I could put it into drive, and then I could have the rest of my gears all no problem. But the moment you slow down again, it was a race car game of trying to get it home. So yeah, so those were the Taurus days. The very last Taurus I had was a 2001. It was what I nicknamed her Simple Bitch, because it was quite funny how I went from a 2001 that was like the most laid out package you could get, and I turned around and bought a 2001 that was a Hertz rent-a-car. It's a very weird and long story, so I'm not going to get into it, but essentially Hertz in 2001 put a big, or in 2000 probably, but put a big purchase of like, say, 100,000 cars for Ford, of the Ford Tauruses for them to put in their fleet, so they could for renting cars and stuff. And essentially, I don't know exactly what happened, but essentially Hertz lost a bunch of money, or they bought something out. I literally don't understand exactly what happened, but essentially what happened was Ford had made these Ford Tauruses specifically for them, so it had like nothing on it. It was the most basic, simple car you could get. And I mean, they make very simple versions of the car anyways, but this one had even less. I mean, we're talking, it had it was hard to explain exactly if you don't know anything about Ford Tauruses, but literally it was like beyond basic. It had a different dash on it because it was like they just got rid of half of anything that was in there. The radio was completely different because it was like not the same as the normal 2001 radio, and essentially because Hertz never bought them, Ford still sold them, they were just like even cheaper because they were what they were. So when I got it, I paid $1,500 for it. I had like issues. I won't say like a lot of issues, but I had issues. I ended up spending by the end of it, I ended up spending about 20 or $3,400. But then I had a car. It ran perfectly fine. I owned it for like 4.5 years. I'd still have it to this day, if not for the fact that um, I put water in my radiator because I'm smart like that, and a very, very hard to get to freeze plug rotted out. So we're talking a $1.25 part rotted out and caused me to have to throw an entire car away because unfortunately it was the one that involved me having to have my transmission and my engine dropped separated because it was behind my flywheel. So, and it was bad. I mean, when I went to drive it home, I was watching somebody skydive, and it was a bit of a drive. I got about halfway home and noticed that my car was like getting there. It wasn't like red on the heat thing, but it was like way farther toward it than normal. And I was like, what the fuck? So I pulled over real quick, and I had a leak. So I thought maybe the leak just got bad, like to the point where it was just pouring out. So I had been carrying gallons of water in the car, and so I went and got the water, and I went to the front and I poured it into the reservoir, and it was just one of those things where, I mean, I know if anybody out there has ever had either freeze plug and or just like a blown radiator situation, I know you know what I'm about to say, but I essentially just poured the water in and watched as it literally just poured out of the bottom of my engine. The entire time I was pouring, it was just pouring out because the hole was so big. The water literally traveled in the engine and right back out. So that was a bit of a kick in the balls because that ensued me to have to sit on the side of the road for like an hour before my car cooled down enough where I could drive it another about mile and a half until it overheated, and then I shut it off again. I eventually got it home. It took very, very many hours, and I was a very angry person. And eventually, fortunately, I was close enough to home where I was just literally pouring the fluids in there, letting it cool down, and then driving, and then stopping, and then somebody eventually brought me some more water. But that's eventually how she died. And I had no money. The car I said lasted for like almost 5 years, and it was I loved that car. I miss it still to this day. Funny enough, I don't know if I never took a photo of it, but like I could not find a photo of it. And then my buddy was going through old photos on his iCloud to delete because he was full on space. And he found a bunch of photos that he took of my car, like right around the time that I got it. And he sent them to me. It almost made me cry because like I missed that car. And I think it's just because I spent so much money on it that like I really, really took care of the car. I mean, besides the fact I was putting water in it toward the end, but I mean, I'm just meaning like, it was my baby, it was the first car that I think I really was like responsible with, because most of the other cars I got and they died within like a year or two, and I got another car and they, it just never really seemed like I had a car that lasted. This was the first car that lasted for me. And so I was very sad to see it go. And then I went carless for just a short amount of time. My parents, fortunately, at that time had a few vehicles they could allow me to borrow. Now, the problem is the vehicle they allowed me to borrow was a van, just a minivan. It was a Montana. I don't know who makes that, if that's a Pontiac Montana. I think so. Just a minivan. It's V6. It was front wheel drive. It drove. It was large in the back. People made fun of me because they were like, "Oh, you drive a minivan." It was like, I don't have a car. And my parents were like, "You can drive the minivan." And I was like, sure. I mean, like, if you don't have a car and you got to get around places, drive whatever you can drive. So drove a minivan for a while. And eventually, my buddy's girlfriend, her grandpa was going to sell or was going to scrap his truck because it was in really, really bad shape, like really bad shape. And he was going to scrap it. And my buddy was like, hey, I got a buddy of mine that's actually looking for a vehicle. He just needs to kind of use it to get around town. And this guy was like, I mean, if he wants it, he can come, he can have it essentially. I gave him $300 because he's still this old man. I didn't want to just take it from him. He literally was going to try to sell it to me for like $10. He was like, all right, just hand me a 10 and, we'll go up there, transfer the title over. I was like, dude, I am going to pay you something for it at least. So I paid him $300 because I assumed that's probably about what he would have gotten for scrap at the time. And, so then I became an owner of a 2001 Dodge Ram 1500 with the 5.9 Magnum motor in it. And I'm not a Dodge fan, being as I have told you I've driven nothing but Fords essentially my entire life. You can assume, yes, I am a Ford guy. But if I had to do a list of what my tiers would be, I'd be Ford, Chevy, and Dodge. And so Dodge is the bottom of my list. And I never thought I would own one or even live to tell the stories to say that I actually loved a Dodge. I didn't own that truck for super long, but when he sold it to me, he told me that I needed to be extremely careful because it was falling apart. Like, this truck was in really bad shape. Rusted all to hell. I mean, parts on it that had probably been broken for 10 years and still haven't, I wasn't going to replace them. And when I got ownership of that truck, I was driving it 45 to 50 minutes away from my house to go to work. And, like, the old man, if he would have known that I was driving it that far to work at the time, he would have probably not sold it to me because he'd been like, dude, this truck's going to break on you, you're going to die. And I think about the only funniest part about it is I'm sitting in like rush hour traffic trying to get home at night, and it's like standstill traffic on the highway. And, you're surrounded by people who, usually when you drive long distances to work, you have like nice cars. So these people are in these like nice cars or SUVs, and they're all, sitting in a line. And then here you have this completely rusted to shit truck sitting there with no muffler that's just literally like as I just sit there and idle waiting for the traffic to move as my truck's essentially overheating because it's old and it needs airflow to but be honest, I still, don't get me wrong, I have still no attraction to Dodge. I mean, if to this day, if somebody again put me in that situation where I had a offering to buy a cheap Dodge and I get to drive it, yeah, I will. I don't really care that much, but it's just the fact of like, if I have the money now, I'm definitely not running out to buy a Dodge. I can promise you that. I would buy a Chevy way before I buy a Dodge, and I prefer a Ford. So that 5.9, I tell you what, when you're it was a full-size truck, but when you're in a 1500 and it's got a 5.9 liter V8 in it, I mean, that truck had power, and I had a lot of fun with that truck. Unfortunately, transmission had some issues. It wasn't the main death of the truck, but it was definitely what led to me needing another car again, or just another something. Then my parents sold me my grandpa's old truck, and that's been the truck I've been driving for, most of the last 4 or 5 years I've had. That was the second longest owned vehicle I've ever had. It was super nice, and I still own it. It just doesn't work. It's a sniffy thing to say. It works, but the transmission slips, and it had been slipping for like 2 years, right? So I've owned a lot of vehicles that have torn out transmissions, and usually when gears are slipping, you don't have very long until the car is eventually just not going to move. So to have had a transmission that has been slipping for 2 years and it's still like, I'm it's hard to explain because again, it's the whole transmission thing, but it's like it drove perfectly fine. It would stay in the gear really high, like farther than it was supposed to. Clearly, it was like sticking, and then it would let off, and that was where it was like slipping. But when it would grab the next gear, it wasn't like clunk like what most trannies do when they're going out. It was always smooth. So that's why I was like not super duper worried about it at first. Even though again that sounds dumb because when trannies slip, you should be worried about it no matter what time of slippage it is. So, it got to the point though that I wanted to fix the truck. I actually wanted, I still do, but it's kind of a lost cause at this point. But I really wanted to fix the truck, and so I had that idea of being like, if I purchase a second vehicle and drive it, then the truck sits like not moving, and then I can fix it or like figure out what to do with it, kind of thing. And so that's the route I went. I went searching for another vehicle. A buddy of mine, actually my best friend, was he for like I think it was like 2 or 3 weekends straight, like at least on Saturdays we would I would get off work and I'd go over to his house and we'd get into his car and we would drive like sometimes even up to like 20-30 minutes away from my house and go to all these like small and dealerships or just dealerships and look at used vehicles and stuff like that because like I really was like I had cars my entire beginning of my life, but then I'm a guy. I know it's kind of like sexist sounding, and I don't mean it to be that way, but I'm a dude who has very simple dude likes. So like I like trucks, and everybody around me drove trucks, and I was like, I want a truck. So then I got a truck, and then I've had 2 trucks, and then it was like, well, if I'm gonna fix my truck, I should probably get a car because then a car gets like better gas mileage, will save me more money, and then I'll have a truck. So I'll have a truck and a car. And so we were out looking for cars, and it was like the second time we were out, and we're out driving around, and we're just talking about him selling his car because the car we were in, he was wanting to sell it. It wasn't that he wanted to sell it. It was just that the car for the year and how much he paid for it and what the mileage of it was and the shape of it and everything like that. It was just a point where in theory he could in theory turn around and flip it for much more than what he paid for it and make a lot of extra money because the car was like, I won't say the Kelly Blue Book value, but it's kind of the best way to describe it because it was the value of the car. They were online and generally everybody was selling the same general years and of the model car for like $4,000 to $5,000, and he paid $1,500 for the car. So he's like, I've only had it for 6 months. I could turn it around, sell it even for $4,000, and be making like bank. So I was like, dude, that's awesome. Like, that's super cool. So we're just like sitting there talking about it back and forth. And he just completely out of nowhere goes, so do you want to buy my car? And, being as we just had this conversation of him talking about paying like $4,000 or like being able to sell it for $4,000 and shit. And that was I won't say outside of my price range, but that was like essentially at the high end of what I was willing to spend. And I was just like, I don't know, because like, it was a nice car, but it was a 95. And it was like, that was weird to me to think that the first vehicle I ever drove was a 93. And I'm like reverting almost all the way back to that year, 20 years later. So, and the weird part about it, especially nowadays, but the weird part about it is I really didn't like the car. It's a 1995 Mercury Grand Marquis. So essentially it is a Panther, which it's a Panther body, which means it's a Crown Vic, but it's Mercury. So it's called a Grand Marquis instead of a Crown Vic. but it's a 95, so it's got the 90s body style, which I do love the 90s body style because I'm a 90s kid. Like, those are the cars of my childhood, but like actively, if like beforehand, if he didn't have that car, I would have never like searched to seek out to buy a 1995 Grand Marquis or even Crown Vic at that point. Um, but he had it, and like I said, he was like willing to sell it, and I was just like, I don't know. To be honest, man, for $4K, I probably would rather get something a little newer, because this thing still had it literally has the exact same motor that my truck has that I'm trying to fix. So like, I'm thinking I can get something that's got like a little 4-cylinder that gets really good gas mileage. And he's like, hey, do you want to buy this V8 car? And I'm like, no, because I'm trying to like get better gas mileage. I don't need to buy the same engine that's in my truck. The truck didn't get super great gas mileage anyways, but it was 10 years newer than the car, so I knew it was clearly probably going to get a little better than the car would. And so I was like, yeah, I don't know, for the year and everything. And he was like, oh, I wouldn't charge you $4,000 for it. He's like, you can just give me $1,500. That's what I paid for it. You can just pay me $1,500. And I was like, what? So like, we finished looking all day, but then naturally, of course, he had it in my head, and he said $1,500, and the car was definitely worth $1,500, and I was like, oh shit. So I went home, and we kind of texted about it for the next couple of days, back and forth, and then eventually he was like, he's like, I come over to your house, pick you up, and you come over to my house, and then we can go out, take it for a test drive, and let you drive it, and see how you feel, if you like it. We went out and drove it, and my God, I did not want that car. I hated that car with a passion. It was real. Okay, if you've ever owned any big boat kind of car that's older, the suspension was real wavy, so it was like everything you hit is like you constantly are bouncing afterwards. The steering on it, because it's the model he had was the taxi model. Grand Marquis, so it had the steering package on it. So it's like you can literally set your pinky on it and be able to turn the steering wheel completely around with your pinkies. So because of that, when you're holding the wheel, if you barely, like, we're talking, if you're just not even really paying attention, or you just lightly twist the wheel, your car's like, and like almost veers you off the road because the steering is like on point. And like I said, it was a V8, so it fucking guzzled gas like I expected it to. And car ran great, and it was, it was in great shape. But like I said, it was just because it was a 95. It was very boat-like. It was, I didn't like the way it felt at all. It felt so foreign, because the problem is I had been driving vehicles with electronic everything for the last, X amount of years, like everybody else. And the Grand Marquis is all mechanical still. So you have mechanical steering, which is rack and pinion, which literally means you have a gear that just rolls back and forth essentially, and that's how you steer. And the throttle is still by cable, meaning I press the throttle and it pulls a cable that actuates the throttle. Like, there's no electronics at all. Well, there is. It's still got a computer. It's just not super. It's still mechanical. It's just how you explain it. Everything's mechanical. It's not electronic. So everything feels way different when you drive everything your whole life, essentially, that's all electronic, and then you switch over to being on something completely mechanical. It was like, yeah, this is, I don't really like this. But it was to the point where I was, like I said, I was going to go with $4,000 to be my high end. Like, that would be the max I would ever want to pay for something. And that was going to be a lot of chunk out of my life. And, now I'm literally being told, and, my buddy, he's like, he was in automotives in high school. Like, he took automotives in high school for 2 years, so like, he has that mechanics background. He works on all of his own stuff, but he paints cars for a living, so he's not really a mechanic, but he's still technically the closest to mechanic that I know. Not really, but kind of. And So he doesn't work on other people's stuff, but he works on his own stuff. So I've seen him fix like essentially everything from, I mean, builds dragsters as well. So again, it's, you know, he knows what he's doing. So he's selling me this car. So clearly, if he's selling me this car is in good shape. He's not ever the type of person that's going to be like, hey, this car is about to die. Hey, Matt, do you want to buy it? You know? So, you know, for him to be offering me to sell me this car, I was like, you know, for $1,500, regardless to whether I really want it or not, this is actually like a really great deal. So I ended up going another week. Whereas I just kind of kept my eye out and looked at things online, but never went and actually looked at it. And then at the end of the week, I was like, fuck. So I essentially said, yes, I'll buy it. And so for the last year and a half now, I have been driving a 1995 Grand Marquis. Now, the thing I said was funny is if you ask me now, I will tell you how much I love that car, how I think the steering in it is perfect, how the suspension is not great, but the funny thing about it is after I got a hold of it, I broke some of the coils, so it's not so bouncy because it's just like flat on the ground, but the front is still bouncy, the front bag isn't, so they kind of even themselves out. She guzzles gas, my God. The car weighs 200 pounds less than the truck, which is fucking hilarious when you have them sitting next to each other and you see how massive this truck is compared to this car, and you think it's only 200 pounds difference, which is definitely gone because I've added a lot of subwoofers to it because the trunk can fit 4 bodies inside of it. I don't know that for a physical fact, but I just watched a video of Crown Vic video yesterday while at work, and the guy literally was like, you can fit 4 bodies in the back. Don't ask me how I know that. And I was just like, okay, cool, like I guess I can use that now. Some guy said you can fit 4 bodies in the back. I don't know, I've never done it, but he says you can do it, and so there you go. But it's big, so I've filled it with a lot of subs, and that's a lot of wood and amp and stuff. So it's just, I'm sure I've added the 200 missing pounds easily back to that car. So gas mileage wise, because of the year and a little bit less horsepower than it has than what my truck comes with, I get generally, I see that's the thing, I've never really calculated it, but if I was having to guess, because obviously I the one that fills up the gas tank, I'd say I'm probably getting between 7 to 9 miles to the gallon because I don't drive it on the highway. I'm only in the city, so I'm very stop and go and, you know, all that bullshit. So, you know, it gets. But of course, as I have bad luck, and I would never have blamed it on my buddy at all. Essentially, I took over the car. It had 139,900 and some miles on it. He stopped driving it when I got interested in it because he told me he wanted me to be the one that rolled it into 140,000. I bought it. I literally, the car only has 141,300 miles on it. So I've literally put only like 1,400 miles on this car in the year and a half I've owned it, and it is just falling apart. It's not that it is falling apart. It runs good and it still drives, but there's just, like I said, I broke 2 springs, so they clearly need replaced. The spring stabilizer thingies, whatever they're called, I forget now. But yeah, there's some other things that need replaced with the suspension. There's nothing else that's particularly broken, but there are things that are definitely worn and probably would be smart to replace them now versus waiting until they're completely gone, like my brakes. Car does not have ABS because that's another thing. It's a 95, so it's still in the year where it was like, yeah, we're not going to give you that. So essentially that means if I'm driving and you hit your brakes really hard and your car slowly stops, you're going to hear me screaming until I rear end you because my car just locks up and the wheels just slide. That's what no ABS means. So I drive about 200 feet behind everybody. I match your speed and I'll do that. So if you're not doing the speed limit, I'm not doing the speed limit 100 feet behind you at least. So that way I can guarantee that if you decide to stop really hard, that I have the space to stop, because literally my car, I mean, it's not instantaneous lockup. You know, you can press the pedal and just have your tires slow down. But I'm just meaning like if you stand on the brake pedal to stop, the car will just lock the wheels up and you will just slide on your, you know. So that's why cars, when you hear cars having, wrecks, you hear the impact of the wreck, but you never. You got all these cars with their fancy electronic brakes and their ABS to the point where you hit the brakes, and so it just kind of goes, ooh, but you can't stop in time, so you still hit the car and it still goes. So literally, there's no noise. You just hear the wreck anymore. But back in the day, back in the 90s and the 80s and anything before that, when two cars got into a wreck, if the one car was about to hit the other car and they hit the brakes, you heard it coming. So you knew what was coming before it even happened. It was, so that's the funny thing of what we've lost with having fancy brakes. You don't have the knowledge of being like, oh shit, this dude's about to wreck into somebody. But I can still do it in my car, so you can still hear me sliding into you, but I won't hear you hit me. Well, until you hit me. And so the car is having issues. So then I don't have a definitive moment, even though I do have a moment where something's definitely happened that was a bit different and confusing. But yeah, I have a blown head gasket in the car because they may or may not have blown it out going fast or something. Like, that's the thing. I don't really have a real memory of a moment where I was like, oh no, I think I hurt my car. But all of a sudden I just started having white smoke come out of my tailpipe, and the car kind of ate oil a little bit, and it's a 95, and it's kind of old, and it's a V8, and at 140,000 miles on it, the rings might be a little, loose and letting a little oil through and, burning a little bit. And it's not too uncommon to drive a V8 and have it eat a little bit of oil. So I kind of assumed at first when I saw the white smoke that it was just the oil smoke of the oil that was getting burnt off in the engine. Essentially, then I started to notice that my antifreeze was disappearing. I did have a leak, so I associated the disappearing antifreeze with the leak, because clearly it's leaking antifreeze and there's a leak, whatever. It's still leaking to this day, but I can tell you what, you can lay underneath the car while it's running, and it drips once every maybe minute and a half to 2 minutes, and it's not a lot. It's just